Oh, great. I'm glad to be here again for our second painting. I do want to remind you that we are recording this, so you can go back in anytime to go back onto the site and rewatch the recording if you would like, if you have any other questions. I want this to be fun for you. Don't stress. This is supposed to be a stress-free evening for both of us, so just relax. I'm going to go step by step, showing you how I would do a landscape. And then hopefully the things that I'm showing you, you can put forth on your painting either now, or if you choose to do it later, or for any other paintings that would use this specific technique. The drawing is very simple this evening. We have a roadway, we have the sky area, one big tree and some grass and some other trees. So it's a pretty general painting. It's pretty easy, but again, this is just to get you started with watercolor. And then there's always the opportunity to get into more experienced tutorials if you're interested. We're going to use a couple of different kinds of brushes this evening. We'll be using a wide flat brush for the sky. We'll be using a big round for the grassy areas. And then I'll be using some of my smaller rounds and also a fine rigger or scripter. I'm also going to be using a sponge this evening. And if you look at my sponge, you will notice it has a lot of fingers. This is the kind of sponge that you want when it calls for a watercolor sponge. You don't want one that looks like a lucky stone, because all that will do for you is give you round, flat marks on your paper, and that's not what we're looking for. You also want to make sure that your sponge is small enough to be manageable in your fingers. You don't want a big sponge that you would be scrubbing cabinets or the sink with. You want a nice small sponge that you can manipulate with your fingers. And when we do sponge work, you want to move the sponge around. You don't want to do the exact same blot everywhere you go, or you will get the exact same paint image everywhere, and you don't want that. And we'll also be using some table salt. So we're going to start off with the sky this evening, and I'm going to paint around my tree because my tree is a nice bright yellow color, and of course my sky is going to be a nice bright blue. So I'm going to work on a wet background, but I'm not going to take that wet background real close to my tree. And the reason being, I want the jagged edge of my tree to be precise. And if I get it wet, then it's going to have more of a muted, blurred image, and I want it to be precise. So when I wet my paper, and when I wet my sky area, I'm going to stay away from getting right up direct to my tree. But I'm going to wet everything else of the sky. And I'm going over the lower trees because the sky is blue, and those lower trees are going to be darker in color. So I can go right over that area with both my water and my paint. I'm just wetting the sky area right now. I'm not wetting anything else because with watercolor, watercolor is named precisely for the fact that your paint will follow your water. So if your water line leads into your grass, your paint will go into your grass if you allow it. I'm going to be using a nice cerulean blue. That's like a nice robin egg blue. And when you're working with watercolor, you want your paint to be wet, because if it's not, then you're not going to get the results that you want. watercolor is transparent and you want it to be transparent. So I'm putting that color on where I wet my paper, and it will have a nice soft blend to it because my paper is wet and I'm allowing my paint the freedom to go where it wants within that water. And then I'm going to use a smaller brush and I will paint up close to my tree line so that I can get a nice rough edge on my tree. I want my tree edge to be just like it would look like the edge of the tree, like it would be loose leaves everywhere. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for anything that makes it look like a lollipop tree. Okay. I'm going to have all kind of zigzags and markings that make it look like rough leaves all along the edge. I'm not worried about the inside area of this tree yet because I will do that later when I'm actually painting my tree. So you can see my nice rough line all around my tree. And you can also see how wet I put my paint on, because when I get up close to the edge, I want this paint that I'm just putting on to blend nicely into the paint of the sky. I don't want a hard line or a hard edge. And the only way that you can really avoid that is if you have your paint nice and wet. And I'm only taking this down to my grass line. I'm not going with my blue below my grass line. Now, again, because I'm so nice and wet, I can lift my paper and allow that paint to move around in the wet paper. You can see how it's actually moving. But then what that does is it softens its edge in the wetness of the paper. I'm wiping off my table so that any paint that I got on my table won't wash back up onto my paper and give me a funny washback line. And I'm also going to blot out my white clouds now while my paper is still wet. You don't have to pick a specific place, but you want to use a soft Kleenex to blot. And all you're doing is laying your Kleenex down on your paper, and you're moving that Kleenex in different directions because, again, just like with a sponge, you don't want exact clouds. You don't want them all to look exactly the same. So wherever you want to have some clouds, that's where you're going to blot with a nice soft paper towel or Kleenex. And then we're going to allow that to settle and to dry. You are going to have some spots within your tree that you'll be able to see the blue sky through. But we're not worrying about that now until we actually paint our tree in. So while that's drying, I'm going to go down. I'm going to move totally away from my sky, and I'm going to come down and I'm going to paint in my road. Now my road is just a simple asphalt road, and it has a yellow painted line to it. So I'm going to paint everything on that road except the yellow line for right now. To get that nice grayish color, I am just using some watered down black. And if there's any of that blue left on my palette, if it's just a little bit, it can mix right in with your black and give you a nice silver gray color. We're going to have more than one wash on the road. So you want to put the first wash on relatively light. You don't want it to be too dark. And if you want, you can leave a couple little spots open on your road along the edge. And that's going to be for the leaves that have blown off this tree. If you forget and you don't leave anything, it's perfectly fine. But I'm leaving my yellow stripe. And I'm allowing that to dry also. Now there are times, and it depends on how much patience you have. I sometimes, if I'm in a hurry, I don't have a whole lot of patience. So I will use a hair dryer, just a simple hair dryer, to dry my picture for me a little bit faster so that I can move on. You want to make sure that if you do use a hair dryer, that you don't put it anywhere where the paint is still flowing, because you don't want to push that water and paint out of the way and make lines on your picture. So you want to wait till your picture forms a matte finish. A matte finish is when the paint is still wet, however, it's lost its shine, and then it should be okay to dry. So we'll take a minute and we'll dry this at least to the touch. Now, the reason that I like watercolor so much is twofold. Number one, I like its transparency. I like that you can layer colors and still see the original colors that you put on through your layers. But I also like it because it's quick. You can get paintings done quicker than some of the other mediums that take hours or even days to dry. I don't have that much patience. So I do like the watercolor because it goes quick and it goes easy. Some of the other things that we're going to be using on this picture, if you have it, you can use it. If you don't have it, it is not going to be a problem. But there is a liquid called a masking agent. It can be called Frisket, it could be called Misket, but it is a masking agent, and you put it on where you want to keep your paper totally white. So in your picture was a white picnic table. I put that Misket on those few little lines that I wanted to remain white. If you don't have it, don't worry. You can simply paint it on with white paint. But in the future, especially if you are really interested in pursuing watercolor, you will have the opportunity to use this quite often. And you can get it either just in a regular bottle like this. This is Winsor Newton's brand, and it's an art masking fluid for watercolor. Or you can actually buy thin tip pointed bottles like this that makes it easier to put the Misket on. So there's a couple different ways that you can use your Misket. One thing that I can tell you, no matter how you get it and no matter how you use it, never ever put it on with a good brush, because it will not come off of your brushes. it'll stay on your brush. It's like a rubber cement, so it's not going to come off your brushes if you use a good brush. The other thing about Misket is you want to get Misket that has a color to it. This is very pale green, but you can at least see it when you put it on your paper. If you get Misket, which comes in white, and you put it on, it's very difficult to see where you even put it. So I always try to get one that has a color to it. Last but not least, there are two kinds of masking agent. There's a masking agent that is removable, and there is a masking agent that is not removable. You definitely need the removable kind. You don't want your Misket to be permanent, because if you put permanent on, then you can't remove it. And that's defeating the purpose of us keeping it nice and clean and white under the Misket. It's very easy to remove. When we're ready to remove it, it just simply rubs off with your finger. Okay, so now I have my sky finished. There is some darkness to some of the clouds that we will put on later. However, if you like your clouds like they are and you want to keep them totally white, you don't have to put any of the darkness on.
Marci?
I see that from Jennifer. If you're talking about tape to put on instead of the Misket, you can use some tape. However, the paint will have a tendency to go under the edges of your paint, and you won't get a nice crisp line like you would get with your Misket. You could simply paint around it also, but if you have multiple areas, you don't want to have to do that. You don't want to have to be watching where you're painting every time, because there are additional layers and you don't want to have to paint around every time you do a layer. Okay. Any other questions, Mark? I can't see them on my end. I don't think I can anyway.
It was just that one.
Okay. All right. Okay, so my sky is pretty much finished. My road, I just have my first wash on. It's going to have additional washes. So we're going to move into the grassy area now. We're going to put our tree line in a little bit later, but I want to get my grass down first. My first wash of my grass is going to be put on with sap green. Sap green is one of my favorite colors because it's a nice green. It's not a Kelly green, so it's not real bright. It's almost like an olivey color, and it works really well for grass and so on. But no matter what color you're putting on, you want it to be nice and wet. I'm putting it on, and I am able to go over my tree trunks over here, because my tree trunks and my trees are all going to be darker than this wash. So as long as you're going to be darker, then you kind of can get away with not with painting over things. But if you're going to be darker than what you're going to put on later, then of course you have to be more careful. I also have to be careful too now around the base of my tree, where I want my jagged leaves to be, my jagged edge to be. But I'm making my jagged edge this time with my sap green. And because I have my Misket in place, I can paint right over that picnic table. I'm painting nice and wet because I want to add in a little bit of a yellow color into my grass to make my grass look like it's not a perfect golf course. I want it to have different colors to it. So in order for that to happen, I want to make it I want to make it nice and wet too.
Marcy,
Yes,
another
Mark.
question about the grass section. Was
Yes.
the grass section not wet before the paint was applied?
I don't need for my grass section to be wet because I don't have to worry about a soft edge on my grass. Grass is grass. If it has a little bit of a texture to it, that's okay because, it simply is grass. I didn't want a texture or any roughness in my sky. So that's why I made my sky wet first. I also didn't want any hard lines in my sky. If you get a hard line in your grass, it's really not going to matter because it's grass. And you could say, well, that's just some of the grass the way it grew, but you wouldn't want that in your sky. So while my grass is nice and wet, I'm going to add a little bit of yellow ochre to that. Yellow ochre is more of an oat color, like wild oats. But I'm going to put that up near the top of my grass. And then I'm going to bring it down my hill. And this is going to help to show also the landscape of this picture. Because by bringing it down the hillside, your eye will be telling you that this is a hillside and that the grass is growing and going down the hill. So I'm moving my grass to be like at an angle, and I'm moving my paper around because moving your paper around, you'll get a nice soft edge to the paint also. And then I'm going to let that get to a matte finish. I am going to be putting on some salt into my grass because I want some additional texture in my grass, and salting adds some wonderful texture to your grass. However, you have to be careful when you put your salt on. If you put your salt on when it's really wet like this, your salt is just going to melt and it's not going to give you the result that you want. But if you wait until your paper where you're putting your salt gets to a matte finish, similar to over here where the shine is gone, but it's still a little bit wet, you'll get a much better result. So I'm going to wait for a moment or two. I don't want to dry it with a hair dryer though, because then I'm going to get a false drying and my salt will not react the same as I would want it to. So I'm just going to allow my paint to sink in a little bit and it will start drying on its own. Watercolor paper is pressed rag, so it's very absorbent to the water. And if you allow it to dry naturally, you'll get a much better result, especially if you're working with salting or texturing. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use a hair dryer because you're putting on different layers. You certainly can, but it's better for your end result if you allow your salt to go on during a natural dry. The other thing about watercolor paper is you can get by with using inexpensive watercolor brushes. You can get by with using inexpensive watercolor paint. But if you do not use good watercolor paper, you will not be happy with your end result. Well, I take that back. You may be happy with your end result, but compared to a painting that you would have done on good paper, you will see a marked difference. Good watercolor paper, and again, it doesn't have anything to do with brands. There's all kind of different brands. I prefer Arches, but that doesn't mean that Fabriano paper isn't good. That doesn't mean that Winsor Newton paper isn't good. That just means that this is the kind of paper that I have been using for a very long time, and I'm just very happy with it, so I don't feel the need to change. But you want to get a nice absorbent paper. You should use a minimum of 140-pound paper, because that's thick enough to give you the absorbency that you're going to want in your actual painting. If your watercolor paper is too thin, it will buckle, and not only will it buckle, but it will puddle. Your paint on the paper will puddle because it's so thin, it doesn't absorb. So your paint just lays on the top of your paper, and you don't want that either. You want the paint to suck down into your paper. That's the purpose of watercolor paper. So I'm starting to lose my shine now. So I'm going to put my salt on. When you are salting your pictures, you want to do it very similar to how you would be salting a roast. Okay, just a little bit here and there. You don't have to put the whole pound salt on. And you want to put that salt where you would like to show some additional texturing. So I sprinkled, you can see where I've sprinkled my salt, and I'm going to give it a little bit of time to work. It does not work instantly, but you will see it when it starts to work. You will see what it does. Each little particle of salt will actually absorb the paint where it landed and leave you a lighter color speckle on your paper. So that's the kind of texturing that's going to come from your salting. We're going to move up now to the horizon line, and we're going to put in some of our trees on the horizon line. It's not going to interfere with anything I've done down here. So I'm just going to move up to the horizon line, and I will show you how to do some smaller trees there. You don't want to use a sponge or anything like that because the trees up there are small. So to put a sponge down, you would have to be using the very little teeny tips of your sponge. It's just not worth that much aggravation. So you want to use a smaller brush. I'm using just my number 2 round, nice and small. And depending again on what color you would like your trees to be. This is a summery picture, so I'm going to make my trees more summery. So I'll be using some of my sap green. And I'm just going to be going along my horizon line. And I'm going to lay my brush flat on the paper and just push it upward. This is called dry brushing. And what you're doing is you are actually, it's called dry brushing, but your paint, you have paint on your brush, so it's not totally dry, but it's not wet like most of the other colors would be. And you can lay that down and put in as much as you want. You can manipulate it to be a shaped tree or just like a tree line. And as long as it's wet, you can add additional colors. If you wanted to add a little bit of brown or a color that will bleed up into your tree just to give it some different colorings, that's fine. Or you can just simply leave it green. Now, where all of your other trees are, more towards the left-hand part of your picture, I'm not going to bother to do trees along that tree line then, because all of these trees are going to be in front of these anyway. So that's kind of redundant to put in all of these trees along the tree line and then just have them covered up later. So unless you are really adamant about putting them in, or if you don't plan on putting in trees in your foreground, then you really don't have to go too much farther than this. Okay. We will give some depth to those trees a little bit later by adding some black. But I'm also going to go on the other side of my tree now and put some trees in over here. You can make them taller. They don't have to all be one length. So you can have them taller. And I suggest that so that you don't have all of your trees looking exactly the same all the way across your paper. And especially, like I said, if you're nice and wet, then you have time to do things with your paint before it goes and dries on you. Once your paint has dried, then it's not going to move about like it would once it's wet, when it's wet, as I said, your watercolor follows the water. So it's going to go anywhere where your paper is wet. It's going to follow the wetness of your paper. Now you have a good idea of what the salting has done. I'll hold it up so you can see it a little bit better. But you see all of those marks from the salt? All of those little granules of salt have sucked up the paint where it's landed and created a texturing. This kind of texturing is great for grass, cement, old wood, trees, for leaves. It leaves a really good texture so that you don't have to try to actually paint in texture. The only time you have to really be careful with your salting is like at the very end when we're going to be putting in our dark shadows from our tree. You want to make sure that all of the salting is off because you don't want little salt specks in the middle of your nice shadows. So you want to make sure that no salt is on your paper at that time. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dry my picture again so that I can take off most of that salt. Now, just a couple little things about salt. You cannot reuse salt that you already used. So don't try to brush this salt off of your paper and save it in a little pile to use again. Once you've used it, it's garbage salt. So you really don't want to use that again. Okay. Now I want to go and I want to put some color on my big tree. I don't want that one to be green. That one I want to be this nice yellow ochre color, which is another reason putting this yellow ochre in was a pretty cool idea because it could look like a lot of those leaves have already fallen from the tree. I'm going to be using my sponge now and my paintbrush. Anytime I use my sponge, there's a couple very important things that you have to remember first about your sponge. Never begin working with a dry sponge. If you start with a dry sponge, your sponge is going to suck up all of the paint that you prepared to put on your tree just to wet itself. So you want to work with a wet sponge. Now that doesn't mean a dripping wet sponge. You want to put it in water and wring it out, but it should be wet so that it doesn't take all of the paint that you prepared to put on your tree just to make itself wet. I also use small little containers to mix my color that I'm going to sponge with. And I do that for two reasons. Number one, you need to mix enough that you know you're going to be totally finished with your tree. And if you try to mix that much on your palette, it kind of takes up your entire palette. And then, you don't have room to put your other color down. So I use separate little containers to mix my paint in, and that paint can stay in here like forever. Even though it gets dry and it peels and it looks like, it's no good, the minute you put water to it, it's fine again. So in my cupboard, in one of my painting cupboards, I have a whole tray of little cups. Some have blue, some have dark blue, some have brown, some have yellow, but I keep them in there just in the event that I'm going to use them again. Now, if you use all of the paint out of the cup, well, then you're certainly not going to keep a dry cup in there, but it's always good to have just in case. So I'm going to mix up my color and I'm going to put it in my cup. And I'm using some yellow ochre, which is that same color we mixed into our grass. And you want to make sure that you use enough pigment, because if you don't use enough pigment and you have too much water, when you put it down, you're hardly going to see any color. So you want to make sure that you have enough color mixed, enough pigment mixed. The more pigment you put in with your water, the darker the coloring will be. If you want to lessen the intensity, then all you have to do is add a little bit of water to it. But you can see I have my paint mixed now, and I'm going to dip my sponge in there. And I'm going to start on the inside. Now, you just want to lightly touch your sponge to the paper. Let's see if you can see this better without that light. Because if you just push it hard, you're just going to get circles of color with no little dots in between. And that's not what you want. You want these little dots, because those little dots is what you're going to see through, and that's where we're going to put our blue sky and so on. So you want to make sure you're nice and wet. You can add additional color with your paintbrush, not so much additional color, but intensity of color. So where you've already sponged, you can just dip in and put some additional color, additional intensity. And you want to make sure that you paint along the edge with a brush. You don't want to try to get all of these little edges with a sponge, because you'll go all over the place. You'll be all out into your sky, and you don't want to do that. The center of your tree is going to have more foliage than the outer parts of your tree. So when you are sponging, you can sponge more towards the outer part, because that's where you're going to leave holes. But the inner part of your tree is going to be more solid. And that's just because there's more leaves in there. You do want to leave holes though, because when we are all finished and we paint either grass or sky in those holes, it's going to make your tree look much more realistic. You want to do this nice and wet also, because by being nice and wet, when we put on some additional coloring in that tree, it's going to look much more realistic. Now, you don't have to get all along this edge right now. You can do that anytime. You could even do it tomorrow, because once your paint dries and it forms a hard edge, it's just going to make it look like it's a leaf. So these little things that aren't attached, you can do those anytime. I do want to put on some additional color before my paint dries. And I definitely want to throw some salt on my tree because I want to show some texture in my leaves. So while I'm nice and wet, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mix a little bit of brown. The brown is burnt umber. And I'm going to mix that in with my yellow ochre. And I'm going to drop that in to my wet part of my tree on the shady side, okay? So my right side is going to be my shade side. So while my paint is nice and wet, I'm putting that color on, and it will follow the wetness of my paint. I don't have to do anything. It's going to do it for me. I don't want to fill in all my holes because I do want some holes that I can see my sky through. But I also want to make sure that I get some darker shades on the shady part of my tree. And then I'm going to throw some salt on my tree. All of these little pieces of foliage, I can fill them in anytime. I don't have to do that now. I'm just waiting for the right time to get my salt on. The salt should not be put on, like I said, when it is really, really wet, or it'll just kind of melt. So you want to wait and you want to get it to a matte finish, which means it's kind of losing its shine. And then you want to put your salt on. And that's when it'll work the best for you. Now, all of these little holes that were created from our sponge, depending on what you see through those holes, that's what you will paint them in with. The holes that I see sky through, I'll paint blue. The holes that I might see grass through, I'll paint green. The holes that I might see my tree line with, I could paint green. The holes that have my tree trunk behind it, I'll paint dark brownish black, depending on what I paint my trunk. Okay, so I'm going to put on some of my salting, make sure that I have a nice soft edge. Lifting your paint up and paint your paper up and moving it around. There's nothing wrong with doing that. You're just moving the paint out. It's going to follow a water path and it'll soften its edge. And then you can put your salt on. And we'll let that dry. While that is drying, I want to go back down to my road because this road is way too smooth. Unless they've just newly asphalted it, there are no roads that are this smooth. So I'm going to put another wash of my watered down black on my road, and I'm going to put a little bit of salt on the path that a tire would make to give my road a little bit of some texturing. I might as well do all my salting at one time, although that is not something that you have to do. You can do it anytime. The only time you have to be careful with salting is if your sky would have still been wet, then you don't want to put any salting around your blue sky, or it's going to make it look like the North Star and many other stars are already out. because that salting would make lines. So I'm going to go through here now, and I'm going to put my color on my road. It's just some watered down black mixed with a lot of water. The area that I left white for some of my fallen leaves, I'm going to try to leave those white again. And I'm definitely going around my yellow line. But now I'm going to put a little bit of salt on just to create a little bit of a texture path. So I'm thinking that my tires would come in this direction, obviously. So I don't want to just throw my salt on anywhere. I want to create a little path with it. Just a little bit of salt. I don't need a whole lot, but I'm just putting enough on that I'm going to create a little path with it. And we'll wait for that to work. Now, when you put your other trees on, they are going to be much darker. The trees that are over in this section, I mixed my sap green with a little bit of either black or some indigo color. And indigo is like a navy blue color. It's a very pretty color. So you could use either one of those. And again, if you want to try to sponge some of those on, you can certainly do that. However, these trees are not too large, so you don't want to, use a bigger sponge and try to put on these little tiny trees. So I'm going to just paint mine on, and I'm mixing my sap green that I used in my grass, and I'm going to use a little bit of that indigo blue, but I'm also going to put a little bit of black to it too, to make it a little bit darker. I've already drawn the trunks to my trees, so I know where my trees have to be. And so I'm going to just follow where I had my trunks. Some nice zigzags. You can dry brush off your edges if you would like to make them a little bit more rough. And I'm definitely leaving some holes because they are not solid leaves. Some of the leaves, some of the areas you can see through. And then I have another tree trunk here. I'm going to make this tree just slightly bigger because I don't want all of my trees to be exactly the same height. I have a nice big tree here. And this one actually will come down into the grassy area because it's a bigger tree. And then I have one back in here. Now, if you wanted to make it look like there were some trees that were in the foreground, you could go to the side of your picture and make it look like there's some tree branches coming from the side of your picture. That gives you some more, trees that are closer to you, kind of like a foreground tree. And you could, of course, do the same on the other side if you want to, but I don't want anything to be that even on my picture, so I'm not going to do that. Now I'm going to go, and while I have this nice dark color, I'm going to add a little bit more black to it. And I am going to go along my tree line now because I want to show some depth to some of these trees. I don't want them all to look like they are directly right in the front of the tree line. I want to place some of them farther back. So to place them farther back, I'm going to pick one of these trees, and I'm going to put my dark green color along the edge of that one. So this is my foreground tree, and I'm putting my dark color along the edge of that. I'm rinsing my brush, tapping it off with paper towel, and I am just going to soften that edge. And what I'm doing there now is I have pushed this one forward and pushed this one back. So you can see now how you can separate out some of your trees just by doing that. Doing the same thing over here. I'm going to make this one here be more up front than the other ones. So I'm using that little bit of a dark color to push this forward and push those back. On the other side here, I want this one to be forward, so I'm pushing this back. So all that's doing is it's giving some depth to some of these trees in the background. I'll move over here. Softening the edge, and by softening the edge, then this one now is pushed forward and those are pushed back. And you can do the same thing over here. I'm actually going to push a couple forward at the same time. And then I'll have some pushed more towards the back. And that's something that you can do anytime. Certainly you don't have to do that all at the same time. Okay. So these trees are drying. You can see how nice my texturing is working here with my salt. You can see how nice the texturing worked here on my grass. But even though it worked really well, I still want to do a little bit more texturing right here. So there's a few things that you can do. You can repaint it and throw on some salt. You can dry brush and create the way that the actual landscaping is moving. Okay. Or you can totally paint it again and not salt, just add some additional coloring. I see there was a question about, did I add additional salt? I did not add additional salting when I did push the trees forward and back, and I did not salt these small trees here. The reason I did not salt these smaller trees over here is because they're so far in the distance, you really wouldn't see a whole lot of detail anyway. So I reserved my salting for this, this tree up here. So I'm going to show you how to create some texturing without using salting. And I'm going to be using basically the same colors, my sap green. I'm going to be using a bigger round brush, not the biggest, but one of my bigger ones. And I'm going to come down the hill with my dry brushing. And just by arching my dry brushing, you already know that that's a hillside. Now, if I want to level out my hillside, then I just simply come straight across. So now you can see that not only do I have that nice hillside, but now my eye has allowed me to follow that straight across. So I know that it's flat right here. So you can see how the landscape is going just by dry brushing. You can dry brush in a few different directions. If you want to make it look like it's going around the bend, you can just dry brush in an archway. Arch your brush, arch your paint to go the direction that you want your landscape to look like it's going. Can you add additional coloring into dry brushing? Absolutely. So if you wanted to, while your dry brushing is nice and wet like that, if you wanted to add some additional yellow ochre or some greens, you just put it in while it's wet. And it'll follow the water. Can you salt your dry brushing? Certainly. If you want to salt it, you can salt it also. So you have additional coloring now that you can put in either just by dropping it in, or if you want to, you can go ahead and salt. It's up to you. I'll throw a little bit of salt on there just so you can see what it would do. It's not going to be as profound as the salting that you did originally because there's already color down. However, you will still be able to see some of the texturing that the salt will do. So we're going to give it a couple minutes, let it do what it wants to do, let everything dry really well. Then I'm going to remove the salt. I will go ahead and paint in behind my leaves here on my tree. I'll paint in my yellow line, and then we're going to work on the tree trunks and our shadow. Your picture that you have right now, even though it's pretty in color, it's boring because it has none of those really deep, intense shadows that really make the picture. And you will see once those shadows are in, the shadows do two things. The shadows are going to, again, help you to see how the landscape is, how the hills are, because your shadows will come straight over and then up a hill. And it'll also give your eye something dramatic to look at. So we're going to wait for a couple minutes, let everything settle in, let everything dry a little bit. I'll dry it a little bit with my hair dryer. And then, Mark, is Nancy there yet?
Yes, Nancy is here.
If she'd like to say a couple things about the Monroeville Arts Council, she could certainly do that.
Okay, Nancy. Nancy, you're muted.
Okay. We're delighted to be partnering with Monroeville Arts, with the Monroeville Public Library, and say a few words about Monroeville Arts Council. We're a very small group of volunteers. We've done many things throughout the years with that small group, concerts and art shows and many things that we're no longer doing because of the pandemic. But we are doing these educational outreaches, again, with Mark's support. And of course, we're delighted to have Marci part of this. And we also, on June 12th, will be doing an art in the park for children. So we'd love your support. If you look at our website, monroevilleartscouncil.org, you can find a way to support us, see what we've done in the past, and perhaps join our group. So that's what we would love. Thanks.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Monroeville, I do belong to quite a few different art groups. And I can say that the Monroeville Arts Council is very active in promoting the arts much more than a lot of the other groups. And I think if you are really, interested in the arts, that's a great group to get involved with. So there's more than watercolor for sure. There's photography, there's oil painters, there's portrait painters, there's acrylic painters, all different kinds of crafters. It's not just watercolor painting. So, okay. All right. I'm going to dry this real quick and then we're going to move on. Okay, so I want to make sure that I get all of my salt off because as I mentioned to you before, you don't want any salting to be on your paper when you're going to be doing any kind of shadowing. So I want to make sure that I get all of that off so that I don't get any spots in my nice shadows. Okay, before I actually do the shadows, I'm going to put my tree trunks in. Okay, my tree trunks, I am just mixing some black with my burnt umber brown. More black than brown because I want them to be nice and dark and visible. And I'm going to be putting my tree trunk on my biggest tree first. So I'm going to be painting that one in first. You may wonder too, if I do a lot of sketching so that I know where I want to paint. Especially with watercolor, a lot of people are not big into sketching because they want their paint to flow. And I can tell you that your paint will still flow even if you have a sketch. I personally like to sketch because I want to make sure that I am only getting the paint where I want it to be. If I allow my paint to follow my water totally, and I don't give it the correct path because I don't know where I drew it, well, then it's going to just do whatever it wants. And hopefully it'll do what you want, and all that it would be like a little happy accident if that was not what you wanted. But I prefer to sketch exactly what I want to have drawn. I'm going to be using a small little brush, nice little brush for my little branches because there are some little branches through here. And it's all of these little details that really help to make a painting. Now that doesn't mean that you have to be quite as detailed as I am, but I do like to have some detail. Now I will go through and decipher what is sky. These holes will be for the sky. Some of them you can leave white because there are some white clouds in the sky. So if you want to leave some white, that's perfectly fine too. But it's nice to have some of the blue come through so that you can actually see that, yes, there were some areas where the blue sky was. And then of course you have some of your darker trees too. So those darker trees can be painted in. Oops, I'm a little bit wet there yet. Those darker trees can be painted in on those spots. And then on the very edge, you can go back and use the original coloring that we used to paint those in. You don't want to leave just white dots on your tree. I mean, the tree is great to have some white spots if you're looking behind at a cloud, but you don't just have white leaves. So you don't want to just leave white spots hanging somewhere. You want to fill those in. And the nice thing about watercolor is you don't have to finish it all now. You can finish it, a month from now. You can finish it a year from now if you wanted to. There's no hurry. It's up to you when you'd like to finish, because you can pick up right where you left off. Okay, so I filled in my tree. I'm going to use my little tiny thin brush to put in my tiny tree trunks on these trees over here. And because they are in a distance, you're not going to see any big trunks. You might see a couple branches branching off or coming through the tree, but you're not going to be seeing anything major. Okay, and then I'm going to paint in my yellow line. Same color as my tree. And I'm going to paint in some of these little yellow white spots over here, make them yellow to make it look like some of the leaves off the tree. And then I'm going to be putting in my shadows. The shadows are what is going to make this so dramatic, because right now, even though it's a pretty scene, it's boring. Your shadows are going to really liven it up, but you want to make sure that you get your shadows in the right spot. There is no rule that says you cannot lightly sketch in your shadows. You can absolutely sketch in your shadows. I generally don't, just because I don't have to, because I've been doing it for so long. But if you have any doubt whatsoever, just use a pencil and lightly sketch in. You don't have to sketch in every line, but you should sketch in where you want your shadowing to be. Okay. My shadows I are put in with some watered down black. You don't want your shadows to be too light. However, they don't have to be pitch midnight black either. I'm going to do just one shadow at a time. I don't want to get too exuberant and just go all over the place. I want to really concentrate on the ones that I'm doing. So I'm going to be doing my shadows on my smaller trees first, and then I will work my way over. My shadows are going to come out from my tree trunks. And then when I put my shadowing in, the key to this too is you want to leave some holes in your shadow, okay? Because your tree is not solid. with leaves. So your shadows shouldn't be totally solid either. Now that doesn't mean you have to leave 100 holes. You certainly do not. But you do want to leave some because that adds to the interest of all of this. And you want to make enough that it's going to take into effect in all of your trees that you have. If you only have one tree, well, then you're not going to make 15 shadows. You're only going to make one nice shadow. But if you have a bunch of trees, then you want to make a bunch of your shadows. I have trees over here because we put this little bit of branching there. So that means there are trees here in the foreground. So those trees in the foreground is what's coming across the roadway. So I'm using a bigger brush for those. Same thing. When I come across the highway, I'm going to leave some holes, but now I want to take into consideration how my landscape is. If I'm going uphill, my shadows should be going uphill. If I'm coming across the roadway and I'm leaving some holes because of the holes in the trees, in the leaves that the light comes through, then you want to do that. And I'm taking this shadow up my hill. And then last but not least, I'm going to be putting in my shadow for my big tree. You have to take into consideration also how that shadow is going to be. It comes down the slope and it's going to go up the slope. Now, it's not going over the hill and down the dale. This is just one tree and it's not, 900 feet high. So you have to be careful too, how big you make your shadows. Plan that out in your head before you get too carried away. Okay. I'm going to also put a little bit of a shadow under my picnic table where my misket would be, because there is a shadow there. And then any other little details that you wanted to put in. I did not put in the yellow or orange cones that were in the picture. I'm not really quite sure what those cones were for, but I'm not going to put those in. But if you wanted to put in any little tiny fence posts that you might have seen, you could put those in and they would just be little straight lines, nothing crazy. Fence posts back at your tree line, you're not even going to see them. They're so tiny. So you wouldn't have to do anything like that. If you wanted to do one going up your hill, you could certainly do that. But then I would pretty much end it there. Okay, one last bit of drying, and then I'll take the misket off for you, show you how to take that misket off, and we're pretty much going to be done with this one. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . your biscuit just will rub off with your finger. And it'll leave your paper white like before you put it on. So this was my white picnic table and my little benches. And then with my real fine brush, I'll just do the legs and so on to the picnic table. Pretty basic. And we're finished. Nice texturing with the salting, nice shadowing with a big brush, nice sponging to get nice detail to trees. And next month, same thing, same things that we're going to be doing. I'll try to do salting again. I'll try to do texturing again. And next month, I think we're going to be doing a floral. So you'll just check back. We're going to be using the same login to do the next class. And Mark can give you more information on that. Any questions that you have? Now's the time. Great, Jennifer. Glad you're excited. We'll see you next month. I'll be here. I'm glad you learned a lot. It's always easier if you can see instead of just telling you what to do. But if you can actually see while I'm doing it, it makes it a lot easier for you. Don't ever get discouraged, especially if you're a beginner. I've been doing this for 30 years, over 30 years. So everybody has to start somewhere. And you are going to learn, you're going to make mistakes. And all I can tell you is, I hope you do make mistakes, because those are the kind of things that you'll remember. If someone is telling you how to do it and how to do it right and how to do it wrong, if you do it wrong, then you will know not to do it that way again. I've had many mistakes in my day, but that's how you learn. So, and some of those mistakes turn into happy accidents. And then you learn that, hey, that really kind of worked out how I wanted. So not all of the mistakes that you think are mistakes are actually bad. Next class is planned for next month, June the 28th. That is a Monday night next month. And we'll be doing this again from 7 to 8:30. And as I said, I think we're going to plan to do a floral. So please tune in. Love to see you all again. I'm sure Mark has my email on the Monroeville site. You can email me with questions at any time. My email is watercolorstudio1021@gmail.com, and I'll be more than happy to answer you personally. So
I've just posted the link to the playlist that has last month's class. It will have this class in the next day or so, and it will have all the classes. They'll all be posted to this same link, so everyone will be able to go back and and review them. And I do think the next class will be at this same Zoom link. Check the website though. Go to our website, monroevillelibrary.org, and you'll find the full announcement. And that will also have Marci's email and the Arts Council email, and it will have the Zoom link.
Yep.
Which I think
and
will be
I
the
saw
same as this
Jennifer-
month, but I'm not absolutely sure.
I saw Jennifer had a question about salting for pets. It will work very well for fur on pets. You just have to be careful where you put it. It's good for curly fur, but like for a smoother fur, it's probably not. It probably won't work the way you want to. But like a nice curly poodly fur, it works great for that. Any other questions? You're welcome. Well, enjoy your night. If you didn't paint along, I hope you will try the painting and follow the recording. And if you'd like take a picture and show me what you've done. Have a good night.
Thanks, Marcy. Thanks
You're
everyone
welcome.
for coming.